The markup will come to order. We will now resume consideration of H.R. 4435. Who seeks recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for bringing this bill forward. Today, we take bold steps to address recidivism and sentencing disparities, provide equal access to Veterans Court treatment programs for racial and ethnic minorities and women, as well as address individuals who claim to practice immigration law and misrepresent themselves. I'm especially proud to co-lead the Fight Notario Fraud Act of 2021, which would hold public notaries who abuse their power. Some of these bad actors take advantage of vulnerable communities with language barriers, or of those who cannot read or fully understand the American legal system. Many Spanish-speaking immigrants, for example, turn to notaries because in their home countries, a notario público refers to a lawyer. So H.R. 4435 criminalizes notario fraud schemes, ensuring that no one can take advantage of the literal-sounding translation of notario público. Significantly, some scammers have fraudulently used the notary public title to market themselves as authorized to provide legal advice and services, especially in immigration law. When I was a legal aid lawyer, I remember seeing firsthand many of the deceitful practices at the expense of indigent people due to their illiteracy or a language barrier. Sadly, that was wrong then, and it is still wrong today. As a member of Congress, we've gotten many of these similar complaints, so the practice still continues. We have a responsibility to protect the well-being and livelihoods of the most vulnerable among us, including immigrant families across our country. Certainly, courts have recognized the widespread prevalence of notario fraud, and the negative impact on immigrants and their families is clear. I want to thank my comadre, Congresswoman Veronica Escobar of El Paso, and Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, my colleague from Houston, for their leadership on this issue, and I thank them for their continued work that started with our other comadre, Debbie Mercosal-Powell of Florida, formerly with us on this committee. I urge my colleagues to support this important legislation. Let's put an end to these fraudulent schemes. And Mr. Chairman, I agree with Mr. Biggs. Is something we should rethink. Frankly, that's just enough for Texas. What are we do about the rest of the states? We should make sure that if we're going to ask for these cases to be prosecuted, that we have enough staff to handle the number of complaints that I know we get in Texas, that he gets in Arizona, that they get in California, New York, Florida, and I could go on and on. Mr. Chairman, this is an important piece of legislation. I urge all my colleagues to support it. With that, I yield back the balance of my time, and I thank you so much for your leadership on this issue.
Gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Stanton seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I am proud to support H.R. 4435, the Fight Notario Fraud Act of 2021. I urge my colleagues to do the same. This bill addresses an issue that affects way too many people in my home state of Arizona. Fraudsters, often without any credentials, pose as legal professionals, offering immigration services to unsuspecting targets. They prey on vulnerable immigrant communities, of whom many do not speak English as a first language. The notario provides advice and counsel as if they are an attorney, but in fact, they are untrained, unlicensed, and too often malicious. The risk posed by these scams is obvious. Mistakes in immigration proceedings and paperwork carry heavy penalties, and too often, the victim of these swindles is left with little or no recourse and faces threat of retaliation. The Fight Notario Fraud Act of 2021 would fix this by criminalizing these fraudulent activities and establishing at least 15 special U.S. attorneys to prosecute the bad actors. And I also want to offer my thanks to Representative Escobar, Jackson Lee, and Garcia for their ongoing leadership on this issue. And I ask my colleagues to join me in supporting this important bill. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. For what purpose does Ms. Ross seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Fight Notario Fraud Act of 2021, led by my colleague Representative Escobar, addresses real harms incurred to vulnerable immigrant communities that fall prey to notario fraud. Spanish-speaking immigrants in particular often face confusion about the role and power of notaries and can be led to believe that notaries are legally authorized to provide legal services. I have seen this in my state. These predatory practices have immense and often irreversible consequences on immigrant communities. Fraudulent notary practices can lead to the missing of key deadlines and the filing of incorrect, incomplete, and false claims with the government, leaving individuals with not only missed opportunities to obtain legal residency, but the possibility of facing criminal liability and deportation. I represent a district with a large immigrant population that's benefited from rigorous enforcement of state laws that prohibit notary fraud. However, not all states have these laws. I'd like to highlight the leadership of North Carolina's Secretary of State, Elaine Marshall, who has led the charge in preventing notario fraud by increasing the capability of the state to investigate misconduct, and has worked with the state bar to provide continuing legal education for attorneys that help identify notario misconduct. She's also improved methodologies to positively identify document signers. But again, all states do not have these protections, and that is why we need this important piece of legislation. I urge my colleagues to support the bill, and I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does Ms. Scanlon seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for putting this legislation for our consideration today, and thank you to my friend, Representative Escobar, for introducing this important bill. As co-chair of the Legal Aid Caucus and someone who's worked for decades to expand access to legal services for those in need, I've seen how important access to quality legal counsel is. This is especially true in immigration matters, where our complicated laws and broken bureaucracy are difficult to navigate, even with legal counsel. But I've heard too many heartbreaking stories from vulnerable immigrants who were defrauded by notarios, posing as legitimate immigration experts. These notarios take advantage of the complexity of our immigration system and the fears of immigrants seeking to navigate it in the hopes of making a better life in our country. And the impact of these fraudulent notarios is devastating. Not only do they extort hundreds of thousands of dollars from families who count on them for sound legal advice, but they often, through fraud or incompetence, irreparably damage legitimate opportunities for immigrants to gain visas, green cards, and other legal immigration status. That's why I'm so proud to support this legislation, which would criminalize unlawful notarial schemes, as well as any threats and retaliation associated with those schemes. Additionally, I'm pleased that this legislation would allocate DOJ resources to ensure that notarial fraud is rooted out and stopped before it can ruin the lives of immigrants looking for legal counsel. Ensuring access to quality, affordable legal aid should be a priority for our committee and this Congress. And part of that effort lies in rooting out bad actors who aim to take advantage of vulnerable individuals looking for legal assistance. I encourage my colleagues to support the Fight Notarial Fraud Act, which would make meaningful change for immigrants across our country. Thank you again to my colleagues for your leadership and your focus on this important issue. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. For what purpose does Mr. Biggs seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment. Point of order is reserved. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 4435, offered by Mr. Biggs of Arizona, add at the end of the bill the following: Section 3, inadmissibility and deportality.
The amendment will be considered as read. The gentleman is recognized to explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, Mr. Chairman, my amendment is quite simple. I mean, we've heard a lot of passion about the gravity of notario fraud, and I'm not minimizing it at all. I think that it probably does, and it is such a problem, quite frankly, because it is being this type of fraud and this kind of action is being used to prey on aliens who are living in the United States. And those who are holding themselves out to be immigration specialists, they take the money of unsuspecting aliens in that way. They're not the kind of people, if they are foreign nationals, that we really want in the United States. They have violated a very serious law. They've impersonated lawyers. They've, and you guys on the other side have really cataloged all the things that can happen and the impact on lives. I was kind of surprised that you left it a misdemeanor, though. So what my amendment does is it ensures that a foreign national who commits notario fraud, as defined by this bill, is both inadmissible to and deportable from the United States. See, a misdemeanor conviction is not enough for the Biden administration to make an alien a priority for removal. So the least we can do, in my opinion, is to speak with a strong, unified voice that people who commit these types of crimes, who are here and they're foreign nationals, they should be removed from the country. I hope that all of my colleagues will work with me to convince the Biden administration that aliens who commit notario fraud and all other aliens convicted of crimes should be removed from the United States of America. Now, when I look at this too, what I find interesting is I think there's an additional flaw in the bill. I'm not going to offer an amendment. I mean, I don't know that it necessarily is appropriate for me to offer that amendment, but I wish you would consider this. When you get to, on the 5th page, line 19, linguistic competence, I understand that you want linguistic competence, but I want to give you some context. You're going to have 15 special U.S. attorneys, and their linguistic capability, their multilingual capability will be considered. The way this is structured here, I hope they speak a lot of languages, because, for instance, in the Yuma sector, just about 6-8 weeks ago when I was down there, the #1 country from which people were being apprehended was Brazil. And I talked to the head of the station. I said, well, how are you doing? Because that's a Portuguese-speaking nation. He says, we don't have interpreters. We don't have translators. That's a problem. What was #2? Russians. Had trouble getting Russians speakers to translate. Romanians, the big groups the two big groups I saw when I was down there, Romanians. That's a problem. So when you have this kind of clause here, you might have an unintended consequence that you can't fulfill the qualification requirement for your U.S. Attorney General, Assistant U.S. Attorney General. I raised that because I don't know that that's intentional. I suspect it's not, but I think it possibly could be a problem. I don't think you're going to have a problem with more common languages like Spanish or even French, but there's also Mandarin and Cantonese speakers. There are Farsi speakers that have come across, and I would assume that some of them are also victimized by notario fraud. The reason I say that is because in my district you can go and you can find mini notarios in storefronts, shopping centers, and so if you're coming across, regardless of what country of origin, you might end up there instead of at a lawyer. Now, I would just raise one other issue that does concern me, and I raised this, and it's not meant. I don't mean to be offering this with humor, but I'm trying to figure out why the state bars, to know they're not enforcing provisions against attorneys practicing law. I wish you would, and I think you're trying to correct that, but I think it observed. So I agree. I hope it's not, and with that, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman yields back. Insist on her point of order.
I do insist on the point of order, Mr. Chairman. The amendment purports to amend Section 8 of the U.S. Code, whereas the bill is entirely about Title 18 of the U.S. Code, and therefore beyond the scope of the bill and is not germane.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman will be heard on the point of order.
Yes, I'd be heard if I might.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I recognize that we're talking in two different sections, but, of the U.S. Code, but I think what's important to understand is if you go to page 2 and you begin looking at, under section 2, and you start going through everything, and particularly on page
Hearing in this bill. The amendment therefore is not germane and violates Clause 7 of Rule 16.
would appeal the ruling of the chair.
I move to table.
Motion to table is made. The motion to table is not debatable. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Nadler.
Aye.
Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren.
Aye.
Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson Lee.
In a non-definitive sense, no?
Mr. Cohen.
I'm going to put you on hold for 1 second. Aye.
Mr. Cohen. Mr. Johnson of Georgia.
Aye.
Mr. Johnson of Georgia votes aye. Mr. Deutsch. Ms. Bass. Ms. Bass.
You're muted.
Ms. Bass votes aye. Mr. Jeffries.
Aye.
Mr. Jeffries votes aye.
Sorry.
Mr. Cicilline. Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Swalwell. Mr. Liu.
Aye.
Mr. Liu votes aye. Mr. Raskin. Mr. Raskin.
Mr. Raskin, you're muted.
Aye.
Mr. Raskin votes aye. Ms. Jayapal.
Aye.
Ms. Jayapal votes aye. Ms. Stimmings. Ms. Stimmings votes aye. Mr. Correa.
Aye.
Mr. Correa votes aye. Ms. Scanlon.
Aye.
Ms. Scanlon votes aye. Ms. Garcia.
Aye.
Ms. Garcia votes aye. Mr. Neguse.
Aye.
Mr. Neguse votes aye. Ms. McBath.
Aye.
Ms. McBath votes aye. Mr. Stanton.
Aye.
Mr. Stanton votes aye. Ms. Dean.
Aye.
Ms. Dean votes aye. Ms. Escobar.
Aye.
Ms. Escobar votes aye. Mr. Jones. Ms. Ross. Ms. Bush. Mr. Jordan. Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Shabbat. Mr. Goomert. Mr. Isa. Mr. Buck. Mr. Gates.
No.
Mr. Gates votes no. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana. Mr. Johnson of Louisiana votes no. Mr. Biggs. Mr. Biggs votes no. Mr. McClintock.
No.
Mr. McClintock votes no. Mr. Stubbe.
No.
Mr. Stubbe votes no. Mr. Tiffany. Mr. Tiffany votes no. Mr. Massey. Mr. Massey votes no. Mr. Roy. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes no. Ms. Fishbach.
No.
Ms. Fishbach votes no. Ms. Sparts. Mr. Fitzgerald. Mr. Fitzgerald votes no. Mr. Benz. Mr. Owens.
Owens, no.
Mr. Owens votes no.
Mr. Chairman, how am I recorded?
Mr. Isa, you are not recorded.
I vote no.
Mr. Isa votes no.
How am I recorded?
Ms. Jackson Lee, you are not recorded.
Yes. Yes.
Ms. Jackson Lee votes yes.
Mr. Swalwell?
Aye.
Mr. Swalwell votes aye.
Are there any other members who wish to be recorded who haven't been recorded? Clerk will report.
Yes. How am I recorded?
Mr. Shabbat?
Mr.
Mr.
Shabbat, you're
Shabbat,
not
how am I
recorded.
recorded? You should have saw. No, here's me.
You are not recorded.
Okay. No.
Mr. Shabbat votes no.
Thank you.
The clerk will still report.
That was pretty impressive, wasn't
Mr. Chairman, there are 20 ayes and 14 noes.
Mr. Biggs' motion to appeal the chair's ruling in his amendment is laid on the table. Who seeks recognition? For what purpose does Mr. Correa seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the table.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 4435, offered by Mr. Correa of California. Page 6, after line 3, insert the following and
The amendment will be
redesignate.
considered as read. The gentleman will explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this most important markup today, and I want to thank Ms. Escobar, the sponsor of this bill, for reintroducing it once again. This bill holds criminals accountable for their crimes for misrepresenting their qualifications to practice immigration law. In my district, this is a minor crime that happens every day that adds up to millions and millions of dollars of damage. A few years ago, the Guadalupana law firm made the local headlines before a local district attorney shut them down. This firm was made up of crooked attorneys, bad notaries who took millions of dollars from hardworking immigrants. And by the time authorities shut them down, they had fled the country. And the worst of it is that these attorneys and advisors recommended that their victims sign documents that were not true, resulting in many of these victims permanently being disbarred from legalization, or barred, I should say, from legalization. I support this Notario Fraud Act, but there is so much more that needs to be done. Let's not forget the real damage is to the victims. They should have at least the opportunity to seek monetary restitution. That's why my amendment requires that practicing immigrant attorneys and accredited immigration representatives have adequate errors and omissions insurance so that victims may be compensated at least partly for their harm. And with that, I support the bill and I withdraw my amendment.
The amendment is withdrawn. Are there any other amendments are there any other amendments?
Mr. Chair.
Reserve a right to object.
For what purpose does Mr. Fitzgerald seek recognition?
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R.
Point of order is reserved.
to 4435, offered by Mr. Fitzgerald of Wisconsin. Page 3, after line 19.
That objection, the amendment is considered as read. The gentleman will explain his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess I would start with saying, once again, we find ourselves kind of in a position of the bill is got a laudable goal, and obviously with what we're hearing and what's been demonstrated today is that this is needed. But I think I do have an amendment before the committee that would once again tighten things up, make things a little bit more succinct, and actually, I think, improve on the statutes. I guess I would also say I'm disappointed that Mr. Correa had withdrawn his amendment, because actually what I'm seeing is that amendment kind of speaks to what we are recognizing as one of the issues, and that is, once again, the cartels. And let me further describe, by definition, they're more transnational criminal organizations. Just, I know that there's different terms that are used sometimes for the cartels, but I wanted to just reiterate that, you know, this is a global issue, not just something happening within the borders, certainly of the United States, but also our bordering countries. So what this amendment would do is, and DOJ has been asking for some of this stuff. They have been trying to root out immigration law fraud and prosecute notarial fraud under mail and wire fraud. That's been going on. It's been going on for a long time. So, because obviously we know fraud's never acceptable, and it's an unauthorized practice. I don't know if you want to call it a shell game, and the way it's been described numerous times is misrepresentation of legal services. So this amendment would allow judges to increase sentencing for any violation of this act when the individual involved is, guess what? Related to the cartels, related to these transnational criminal organizations. And you would say, well, how would you determine that? Well, the way you would determine it is by the case or by trying to prosecute. You know, that's how this would emerge. That's where this would come from, is in that prosecution. Because that would reveal the connection. Because otherwise, what we are led to believe, based on what we're seeing today, is that these are all just individuals operating on their own. Come on. That's not true. We know that's not true. So I think this amendment goes a long way to, once again, improving the bill, improving the efforts of the author. I applaud Representative Escobar in what's going on here. But again, I think this amendment addresses something that clearly is happening and would make this bill much better. And I would yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentlelady from California seek recognition?
I move to strike the last word.
Oh, do you insist on your point of order?
I had the point of order. I do not insist on my point of order.
Point of order is withdrawn.
It is withdrawn.
Gentlelady is recognized.
I'm pretty confident that every single member of this committee opposes the drug cartels. I mean, that's a given. And most of them are transnational organized crime. But I don't know really what else is transnational organized crime. To be honest, although I have watched these predators for many years, the notorios, I've never once, even when there have been local prosecutions, there's never been an instance where they were connected with the cartels. So I think this is worthy of further investigation, but I think the drafting of this is loose enough that I don't know that we would know what we would be voting to approve. So I couldn't support this today, but I do, and I don't think there's really any nexus, honestly, between the notorios and the cartels, although if there is, certainly we would want to do something about that. But whether or not there's a connection between the notorios and the cartels are a threat. They're a threat to our country, and they're a threat to individuals who run into them, whether those individuals are documented or undocumented. They're a threat to our law enforcement officers. They're bad dudes, and we're against them.
Would the gentlelady yield for a question?
I would be happy to yield.
I thank the gentlelady, and I guess the question that occurs to me as I hear your argument in response to this amendment is, what harm does it do? It would apply enhanced penalty if someone who's engaging in this conduct that the bill seeks to strike at also is a conspirator with one of the cartels.
Reclaiming my time, transnational organized crime is not defined, and that's the concern. When we pass a law providing for imprisonment of 4 years, I think we ought to know specifically what the terms mean, and we do not know what the terms mean in this amendment. That doesn't mean, and I'd be happy to yield. That doesn't mean that we couldn't find out. We could have a hearing, we could do some research, but I don't think we know at this moment what that term means, and I'd happy to yield to the gentlelady who's done so much good work on this bill. To the gentlelady who's done so much good work on this bill, the gentlelady from Texas.
Thank you so much, Ms. Lofgren, Representative Lofgren. To my colleagues, I think you know I represent El Paso, Texas, on the southern border, a border community. Before I was in Congress, I served in local government, and so I've been fortunate to be a public servant for a long time for my community. I have, even as a local elected official, I received complaints from community members about notario fraud. I have never once heard they are linked in any way that is identified in this amendment. And as close to the community as it gets. In crafting this bill and speaking with colleagues from across the country, I have never once heard that this is an issue. I would be very interested in any examples that you all might have come across, because if there is an example, I'd love to explore, talk about it, and as Ms. Lofgren mentioned, let's even have a hearing about it. And I will tell you, I'm someone who believes that the cartels are evil, and the way that they prey on one of the most vulnerable human beings is detestable, horrific. And so I absolutely stand with anyone who wants to legislate to create better safety for the vulnerable against the evil that is the cartel. But I think it's so important to make sure legislate to solve a problem that exists and we don't create overreach for something that doesn't exist. And so I would love the examples that might exist, but after years in public service, I have not. And thank you so much, Ms. Lofgren, for yielding. I appreciate the time.
Lady, for yielding back, I would just note that over the years, I've run across cases where just horrendous actions have occurred because of this fraud. And it's important that this bill, which I think has a match in the Senate, and pass along the lines that can pass in the United States Senate, because real harm is being done to innocent people who are trying to comply with the chairman.
Yields back. Recognition.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you. And I wonder, it seems to me that this is, I have a hard time seeing what's difficult about this. I do understand the comment of the gentlelady from California, I guess, in a technical way, that that there's no definition in the amendment of a transnational organized crime. But then again, I doubt that's a very big obstacle. And I don't see what mischief could occur because it's not a term that is likely to be thought of as ambiguous. Organized crime's pretty clear. Transnational organized crime's pretty clear. And so the possibilities, or the problem, it seems to me, would exist if a court were to over-interpret it to include a bunch of stuff that wouldn't be included.
Mr.
I'd be delighted to yield.
I just want to associate myself with the remarks of the gentlelady from California. This is a criminal statute, and so there are significant problems if definitions are not provided, because you have to provide notice to a defendant or an accused of what the circumstances are that led to the charges that have been leveled against him. I was a practicing criminal defense lawyer for many, many years. You can't leave it up to courts to decide what those terms mean, because that doesn't provide sufficient notice to an accused. It raises serious due process questions.
Reclaiming my time, and I'd be delighted to perhaps extend more time but just to engage in something in the nature of a colloquy if we could. I would submit that we were just in a very long markup over some bills that had great potential impact, that had some terms that were extraordinarily broad and ambiguous and not defined, like critical trading partner, if that rings a bell. And so invariably, courts have to interpret words that Congress has not defined with great precision, but I would contrast this situation with that one and invite the gentleman from Rhode Island to comment on that.
Yeah, of course. Well, there's obviously a very significant difference between a criminal statute that imposes penalties of imprisonment and requires due process considerations that don't exist in the civil context. So they're completely different.
To facilitate or solve the problem, I seek to be recognized to offer a second-degree amendment. Mr. Chairman.
Can we recognize?
I seek to be recognized to offer a second-degree amendment.
Gentleman is recognized.
And the amendment is at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Yeah.
Reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved.
Amendment,
Point of parliamentary inquiry, Mr. Chairman. Who controls the time right now?
I've just sought to be recognized for a second-degree amendment and was so recognized.
Okay.
35, offered by Mr. Bishop. Page 3.
Without
after-
objection, the amendment is considered as read. The gentleman will explain his amendment.
I thank the chairman, and I assume I get a new 5 minutes.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So this amendment will interpose the language following the term transnational organized crime. And I think that solves the problem to which Mr. Cicilline spoke. And again, it seems to make great sense. It certainly ought to have any concerns whatsoever about Mr. Fitzgerald, because all his amendment does, for goodness sake, is say if someone who's engaged in this notario fraud that the bill strikes at is also engaged in this transnational organized crime that we all know, and Ms. Lofgren made the comment, everybody's against it, and frankly, the enhancement's not that significant. There are crimes, penalties as long as 3 years against these laws, I think, a matter in more than $10,000. And in this case, it would